Let me tell you something powerful, something that not everyone will understand unless they've lived it. When the super empath goes no contact, it isn't about revenge. It's not about silence as punishment. It's about survival. Super empaths are the healers, the givers. They show up with open hearts. Even when there's a breaking, they forgive things others would walk away from. They try one more time and then one more after that. They keep believing in someone's potential, even while being hurt by their reality. But here's what people forget. Even the strongest emotional caretakers have a limit. When the super empath goes no contact, it means they finally chose themselves. It's the moment they realize that staying is slowly destroying them, their peace, their spirit, their identity. And the hardest part, they're not angry when they walk away. They're heartbroken, but they walk anyway. And something magical happens after that. At first, there's grief, the kind that hits in waves. They'll doubt themselves. They'll cry over the good moments. They'll miss the connection that once felt sacred. That's normal. It's the detox from emotional dependency. It's the emotional hangover from loving someone deeply who couldn't or wouldn't meet them there. But then comes clarity. They begin to see things for what they were, not through the lens of who they hoped the other person would be, but who they consistently showed themselves to be. And once that clarity takes root, confidence follows, not arrogance, peace. The super empath finds power in boundaries. They stop confusing compassion with self-sacrifice. They learn that love without respect isn't love, it's self-abandonment. So if you're the one who lost the super empath after they went no contact, let me be clear, they're not playing games. They're not coming back, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves just a little bit more than the person who never did. When a super empath goes no contact, the world often misunderstands their silence. It's easy to assume they're being cold, dramatic, or trying to make someone feel guilty. But none of that could be further from the truth. Going no contact for a super empath is not an act of revenge, it is an act of survival. It's the quiet moment when they realize that staying in connection with someone who continuously drains them is no longer a path to healing, but a slow erosion of their own mental and emotional well-being. Super empaths are wired to care, to nurture, to feel deeply not just for themselves but for others. They pick up on every shift in tone, every flicker of pain in someone's eyes, and they absorb it. They try to fix what they didn't break. They offer understanding even when it's not deserved. They stay when it's easier to leave, and they give chances long after trust has worn thin. But when those patterns repeat, when they're taken for granted, manipulated, or emotionally depleted, something inside of them begins to shift. It's subtle at first. Maybe they just don't text back as quickly. Maybe they pause before apologizing for something they didn't do. But eventually, they reach a breaking point. That breaking point is sacred. It's not explosive, not fueled by rage, not accompanied by a dramatic exit. It's often quiet, internal, and deeply personal. It's the realization that continuing to engage with someone who cannot or will not meet them halfway is no longer sustainable. It's the gut-wrenching clarity that their empathy has been used as a loophole, a way for others to avoid accountability, to drain their energy without ever filling their cup. No contact becomes the only option, not because they want to hurt someone, but because they need to stop hurting themselves. It's a boundary drawn in silence, a line that says, I've had enough. And for a super empath, that line takes incredible strength to draw. They don't want to disconnect. In fact, they've probably spent sleepless nights debating whether they're overreacting, whether they could have done more, whether they're being too sensitive. But deep down, they know staying is no longer loving, it's enabling. Choosing no contact is not about control or punishment. It's not a tactic, it's not passive-aggressive. It's the first time in a long time that the empath says, my energy, my peace, my soul matters too. It's a reclaiming of self-worth, a declaration that they will no longer negotiate their value for the sake of keeping someone in their life who doesn't treat them with the respect they deserve. The outside world might not understand. The person they disconnect from might be confused or even offended. But that doesn't matter anymore. Because when the super empath goes no contact, it means they've finally stopped making everyone else's needs more important than their own. And that is not selfish, it is necessary. Super empaths don't walk away easily. They are not the type to cut someone off at the first sign of discomfort or conflict. In fact, they're the opposite. They stay through the rough patches. They give chances even when the evidence says they shouldn't. They hope, they believe, and they keep showing up over and over. Because deep down, they're not just loving someone, they're trying to help them become who they could be. Empaths have this extraordinary ability to see not only who someone is, but also the best version of who that person could become if they chose growth, honesty, and accountability. Because of that vision, they stay. They endure behavior that chips away at them. They forgive lies, excuses, distance, emotional neglect. Not because they enjoy being hurt, but because they genuinely want to believe that love and patience can transform a dynamic. They convince themselves that if they just love harder, communicate better, or wait a little longer, the person they care for will finally rise to meet them. That kind of hope is beautiful, but it can also become a trap because it causes them to endure far more than they should. Each time they forgive, they also suppress a little bit of their own pain. Each time they excuse toxic behavior, they sacrifice a part of their own emotional safety. And slowly, piece by piece, they begin to abandon themselves. Their boundaries blur, their self-respect softens. They shift their own needs to the side in order to keep the peace or avoid conflict. They become the emotional caretaker in the relationship, managing the other person's moods, excuses, and wounds, while neglecting their own. But there's only so much a person can take. Even the most resilient heart has a threshold. Eventually, there comes a moment when something clicks. It's not always a dramatic event. Sometimes it's subtle, a conversation that feels like déjà vu, a promise broken one too many times, an apology that feels rehearsed, and in that moment, the super empath realizes they've done everything. They've communicated, compromised, shown compassion, offered space, extended grace, swallowed pain, and waited longer than they should have. And still, nothing changed. That's when the truth settles in. No amount of their love can make someone grow who refuses to. That's when they know they can't carry both people's emotional weight anymore. So when the super empath finally decides to go no contact, it's not impulsive or reactionary. It's not a game or a bluff. It's the result of deep emotional exhaustion. It's the quiet outcome of being the only one who ever really tried. They walk away with sadness, not anger. They grieve the potential more than the person, but they also walk away with strength because choosing to leave is not about giving up on someone else. It's about finally choosing to stop giving up on themselves. The decision is rarely easy, but it is deeply necessary. It marks the moment when they understand that staying loyal to someone else should never come at the cost of betraying themselves. The early stages after a super empath goes no contact are often the most painful. It doesn't matter how justified the decision was or how much they needed to protect themselves. What follows is rarely immediate peace. Instead, there's an emotional crash. The silence they created for their healing can feel like a void. The absence of connection, even if it was harmful, still leaves a hole because the empath didn't stop caring, they stopped engaging. And that's a completely different kind of heartbreak. Grief shows up in unexpected ways. It can look like replaying conversations, wondering if things could have gone differently. It can sound like an inner voice that questions the decision. Even when the facts are clear, it can feel like loneliness that creeps in during quiet moments, whispering doubts that maybe the chaos was better than this emptiness. This isn't weakness. This is what happens when someone who gives everything finally has nothing left to give and is forced to sit with the emotional consequences of that. For a super empath, love was never shallow. They didn't just offer time or attention, they offered understanding, patience, and emotional energy that went beyond the surface. When that kind of investment is severed, it hurts on a level that others may not see. And because empaths feel deeply, they often second-guess themselves even more deeply. They might wonder if they were too sensitive. They might remember only the good moments and temporarily forget the patterns that led them to disconnect in the first place. This mental loop can keep them stuck in guilt or longing, even though the decision to walk away was the healthiest one they could have made. The emotional detox period is crucial. When an empath has been in a dynamic that required constant giving, silence feels foreign, almost unsafe. The nervous system has been conditioned to respond to the highs and lows, the unpredictability, the constant managing of someone else's emotions. So when it all stops, the empath might initially experience withdrawal. And just like with any detox, the symptoms are messy. Tears, restlessness, insomnia, cravings for connection that logically make no sense. All of it is part of the body and mind unlearning unhealthy attachment. But even in this pain, something meaningful is happening. The empath is beginning to separate who they are from who they became in order to survive that relationship. They're learning to sit with their feelings rather than fixing someone else's. They're starting to ask, what do I need right now? A question they've ignored for far too long. Though the early stage is full of emotional noise, it's a necessary part of clearing the fog. The pain doesn't mean the choice was wrong. It means the love was real, the investment was deep, and the healing is just beginning. In time, the waves begin to settle. The grief, while still present, becomes something the empath can carry. They start to recognize that missing someone and choosing not to return can coexist. That's where strength begins to take root, quietly but surely. Clarity is one of the most powerful and often most painful gifts that comes after a super empath goes no contact. In the beginning, everything feels clouded by grief, guilt, emotional residue, and longing. The heart still wants to believe in the version of the person they fell for, the version that showed glimpses of potential charm, warmth, and even love. But after enough time and distance, the fog starts to lift. The empath begins to see the relationship not through emotion or hope, but through patterns, repeated actions that tell the real story. This clarity doesn't come all at once. It arrives in pieces, a memory resurfaces, and instead of making excuses for someone's behavior, the empath begins to view it with honest eyes. They remember how often their feelings were dismissed, how many times apologies were empty, how they constantly had to shrink themselves to keep the peace. Things they once tolerated suddenly feel unacceptable. Behaviors they used to explain away now seem glaring. That's when they realized they weren't overreacting. They were responding to consistent red flags. One of the most profound shifts happens when the empath stops focusing on isolated good moments and starts looking at the overall emotional pattern. Yes, there were times when the other person was loving or attentive, but those were often followed by silence, manipulation, deflection, or control. The emotional highs were used to keep them invested, to create a bond strong enough to overlook the lows. This cycle is what kept the empath hooked, not because they were naive, but because they love with loyalty and depth. But now, with space and perspective, they can finally see how unhealthy that cycle was. Clarity is not about demonizing the other person. It's about being honest, radically honest, about what was actually happening. It's the moment the empath stops trying to decode mixed signals and starts to trust their own emotional reality. They stop blaming themselves for someone else's inability to show up consistently. They stop justifying their pain just because the other person occasionally showed kindness. Clarity teaches them that inconsistency is not love, and that confusion is not chemistry. What also becomes clear is how much of themselves they lost while trying to keep the relationship alive. They begin to notice how small they became in order to avoid conflict, how often they silenced their own needs, how long they lived in emotional limbo. It's not easy to face, but it's liberating, because from that place of truth, they can finally start to rebuild. Not based on fantasy or potential, but on self-respect and truth. Clarity doesn't always feel good at first. It often comes with waves of anger, sadness, even shame for how long they stayed. But it's also the beginning of real empowerment. Because once the empath sees the situation for what it truly was, they stop hoping for closure from the other person. They stop needing validation or apologies. The truth becomes enough, and that truth is what begins to set them free. Not overnight, but with every honest reflection, they reclaim more of themselves. After going no contact, the super empath begins to understand something that once felt completely foreign. Boundaries are not walls. They're doors with locks, and they hold the key. For so long, the empath may have associated love with sacrifice. They believed that to truly love someone meant to be endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly flexible. But through the pain and distance, a powerful truth begins to take shape. Real love does not require self-abandonment. Real love includes respect. And that respect starts with the self. Boundaries are not created out of bitterness. They're built from clarity. Once the empath sees how much they gave, how often they ignored their own discomfort to avoid upsetting someone else, how frequently they prioritized peace over honesty, they begin to feel the weight of what they've lost. Not just in the relationship, but within themselves. Setting boundaries becomes the way they start reclaiming that loss. It's not about pushing people away, it's about letting the right people in under the right conditions. This shift is transformative. For perhaps the first time, the empath begins asking a different set of questions. Instead of, how do I make this person happy? They ask, does this relationship make me feel safe? Instead of, what do they need from me? They ask, is this mutual? And most importantly, they stop interpreting discomfort as a challenge to fix and start seeing it as a signal to pay attention. When the empath starts to use boundaries as a new framework for love, everything changes. They no longer give access to people just because of shared history or potential. They no longer tolerate inconsistent behavior in the name of understanding. They learn that their empathy is a gift, but it doesn't mean saying yes to everything. They learn that saying no is not cruel, it's self-care. And perhaps most importantly, they stop equating silence with strength. They begin to speak up when something feels wrong rather than internalizing the blame or minimizing their own discomfort. This doesn't mean the empath becomes hard or cold. They remain deeply compassionate. But now their compassion includes themselves. They're still loving, but that love has standards. They're still generous, but that generosity is no longer unconditional when respect is not present. The way they love changes. It becomes more discerning, more intentional, and far less rooted in emotional survival. They begin to recognize who is emotionally safe and who is not. They listen to energy, not just words. They trust actions over promises. And they understand now that anyone who demands their love at the cost of their well-being is not someone they can afford to keep close. The new version of love they hold isn't based on what they can endure, but on how they can thrive. Boundaries become their way of choosing people who can meet them where they are without needing to be saved, fixed, or tolerated. And in that space, they finally find peace, not just with others, but within themselves. And so when the super empath goes no contact, it's not an act of cruelty, it's an act of clarity. It's not about shutting someone out. It's about finally letting themselves in. It's about choosing peace over chaos, boundaries over burnout, and self-worth over empty potential. They didn't walk away because they stopped loving. They walked away because they finally started loving themselves enough to stop bleeding for someone who never noticed the wounds. This journey isn't about bitterness. It's about becoming whole. The super empath didn't go cold. They went conscious. Conscious of their value, their energy, and the kind of love that no longer costs them their spirit. So if you've ever had to walk away to protect your heart, or if you're standing on the edge of that decision right now, know this: your peace is not selfish. Your healing is not optional. And your silence is not weakness. It's wisdom. Thank you for listening. Thank you for honoring your journey or the journey of someone you love. And above all, thank you for remembering that walking away doesn't make you less loving. It means you finally decided to love with intention. Take care of your heart. Guard your peace. And never forget, the strongest love you'll ever give is the one you give to yourself. Goodbye, and thank you